The first time Valerie Dawson walked into the dusty trading post in Silver Creek, Colorado, every eye in the place turned to stare not with admiration, but with barely concealed mockery. Standing barely 4 feet 10 inches tall, she looked more like a child than a woman of 21, despite the determined set of her chin and the pride in her posture. It was 1878, and Silver Creek was still raw and unforgiving, like most frontier towns that had sprung up in the wake of the Silver Rush. The locals weren't accustomed to seeing someone so diminutive attempting to make her way alone in the harsh western landscape. Valerie approached the counter, ignoring the whispers and chuckles that followed her. "I need supplies," she announced to the shopkeeper, her voice stronger than her frame suggested. "Feed, flour, coffee, and information about available land for purchase." The shopkeeper, a portly man with tobacco-stained teeth, leaned over the counter. "Land, you say? What's a little thing like you gonna do with land out here? Wind'll blow you away first storm that comes through." His laughter invited others to join in. From the corner of the store, a massive figure straightened up from examining a box of tools. Towering at 6 feet 6 inches, Thomas Prescott cast a shadow that seemed to darken half the store. His broad shoulders strained against his worn cotton shirt, and hands that could easily break a man's neck gently set down the hammer he'd been inspecting. "I believe the lady asked for supplies and information," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying an authority that silenced the room instantly. "Not commentary on her stature," the shopkeeper's smile faltered. "Just having some fun, Prescott, no harm meant." Thomas moved to stand beside Valerie, and the contrast between them was stark. She barely reached his elbow. "Miss, I work as foreman at the Silver Creek Ranch. If you're looking for land, there's a parcel that borders our eastern fence line. Good water access, decent soil. Owner passed last winter and his kin back east are looking to sell." Valerie looked up at him, so far up it nearly hurt her neck. His face was weathered by sun and wind, with a scar running along his jaw that spoke of hard living. But his eyes, a clear, steady blue, held no mockery, only respect. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott," she said formally. "I would be interested in seeing this land." "I can take you tomorrow if that suits," he offered, his voice still quiet. "It's about an hour's ride from town." A voice called from the back of the store. "She ain't gonna last a week out here. Bet she can't even reach a stove to cook her own meals." Laughter rippled through the store again. Valerie's cheeks burned, but she kept her gaze steady. "I've been cooking my own meals since I was 8 years old, sir," she replied evenly. "And I didn't come all the way from Boston to be discouraged by the first small minds I encounter." Thomas's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "I'll meet you here at sunrise, Miss Dawson, Valerie Dawson, Miss Dawson." He nodded respectfully before turning to leave, pausing only to fix a cold stare on the men who had been laughing. They suddenly found other things to examine. The next morning, Valerie arrived at the trading post before the sun had fully risen. She wore a practical riding skirt and had her dark hair neatly braided and pinned beneath a modest hat. Thomas was already waiting, sitting atop a massive chestnut gelding. Beside him was a smaller, dappled mare. "I took the liberty of borrowing Mrs. Wilson's horse for you," he explained. "Figured you might not have your own yet." "That was thoughtful, Mr. Prescott," she said, approaching the mare cautiously, "but I should warn you I'm not much of a rider." Thomas dismounted in one fluid movement despite his size. "No need to worry. Daisy here is gentle as they come." He approached with a mounting block that would have been unnecessary for most women but was essential for Valerie. She was touched by his foresight. He'd anticipated her need without making her feel self-conscious about it. As they rode out of town, Valerie kept her back straight despite her nervousness on horseback. "You must be wondering what brings a woman like me out west alone," she said, after they'd been riding in comfortable silence for some time. Thomas's gaze remained on the trail ahead. "Every soul out here is running to something or from something. Not my place to pry." "I'm not running," she corrected him. "I'm seeking." My father was a doctor and I assisted him for years. When he passed, I found I had no place in Boston society, too educated to be a proper lady, too small to be taken seriously in medical circles. And you thought the frontier might be more accepting? There was no judgment in his tone, only curiosity. Valerie laughed, the sound bright in the morning air. Hardly, but I thought people here might need me enough to overlook my shortcomings. Frontier towns are always desperate for medical care. Thomas glanced at her with new respect. You're a doctor, then? Not officially. Women aren't allowed in medical schools, but I have more practical experience than many who hold the title. Her chin lifted slightly. And I saved enough to purchase land and build a small practice. I intend to grow herbs for medicines as well. They crested a hill, and Thomas reined his horse to a stop. Below them stretched a valley green with early summer growth, a creek winding through it like a silver ribbon. This is it, he said simply. 20 acres. Creek doesn't run dry even in August. Valerie's eyes widened as she took in the landscape. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it looked fertile and sustainable. It's perfect, she breathed. Thomas pointed to a flat area near the creek. Previous owner had a cabin there, but it burned down years ago. Foundation's still good, though. Valerie's face fell slightly. I hadn't considered I'd need to build a home first. I'm not sure I have the skills or strength for that. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying the land. Building a proper cabin takes time and many hands, but I could help you get started. Raise a simple structure to get you through until something more permanent can be arranged. You would do that? Why? Her question was direct, without artifice. His eyes met hers. Because out here, we help each other survive. That's the code of the West, the real one, not the nonsense about gunfights and glory. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Thomas showed her where the soil was richest for her medicinal garden, where the creek was safest to cross, and pointed out landmarks she could use to navigate the surrounding area. By the time they returned to town, Valerie had made up her mind. She went directly to the land office and used nearly all her savings to purchase the property. The clerk looked skeptical when she signed the papers, but with Thomas standing silently behind her, no one dared make any disparaging comments. The following weekend, Thomas arrived at her property with a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. Valerie had been camping in a small tent, already establishing her herb garden near the creek. Mr. Prescott, she called, walking toward the wagon. This is far more than I expected. Thomas was already unloading supplies. Ranch owner owed me some back pay, figured this was a good use for it. I can't accept such generosity. At least let me repay you when I'm established. He shook his head. Consider it an investment in having a doctor nearby. Anderson Ranch has 30 hands, and they're always getting themselves injured. Over the next several weeks, a routine developed. Thomas would work his regular job at the ranch during the week, then spend Saturdays and Sundays helping Valerie build her home. His massive hands, so capable of violence when needed, showed surprising delicacy when measuring and cutting lumber. He worked methodically, teaching Valerie as he went so she could continue some tasks in his absence. Despite her size, Valerie proved remarkably resourceful. She couldn't lift the heavy beams, but she devised a system of pulleys that allowed her to raise materials that would have otherwise been impossible for her to manage. Her medical knowledge gave her a precise eye for detail, and she quickly learned to cut and shape smaller pieces with expert skill. Word spread through Silver Creek about the tiny woman and the giant cowboy building a home on the old Peterson place. Some still mocked Valerie when she came to town for supplies, but their words carried less sting now. Each weekend, she watched the structure of her new home take shape under Thomas's guidance, and her confidence grew alongside it. "You're designing this differently than most cabins I've seen," she observed one afternoon as Thomas installed a lower countertop in what would become her kitchen. "Figured you'd appreciate not having to stand on a box to knead bread," he replied, carefully measuring the height against her reach. Valerie was momentarily speechless. No one had ever adapted the world to fit her before. It had always been her responsibility to adjust, to stretch, to climb, to find workarounds for a world built for larger people. "Thomas," she said softly, using his first name for the first time, "thank you for seeing me as I am and not as a problem to be solved." His hands stilled on the wooden counter. "My ma was a small woman too, not as small as you, but she struggled with a world built for men's convenience." Pa never thought to adjust things for her. His voice grew quieter. "I always promised myself I'd do better." As summer progressed into early fall, the cabin took final shape. Thomas had built it stronger than most, with extra reinforcement against the harsh mountain winters. The roof was pitched steeply to shed snow, and he'd constructed a clever system of shutters that could be closed from inside during blizzards. Throughout the building process, they talked. Thomas spoke little about his past, but Valerie learned he'd fought for the Union in the war, despite being only 17 when he enlisted. His size had made him seem older, and the recruitment officers hadn't questioned him too closely. After the war, he drifted west, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, never staying in one place too long. Valerie shared stories of growing up in Boston, of learning medicine at her father's side, of the frustration of being dismissed because of her stature rather than her skills. "People assume I'm a child," she said one evening as they sat by the fire after a long day of work. "Or worse, that I'm simple-minded because I'm small, as if my height determines my intellect." "People make the same mistake about me in reverse," Thomas replied, his massive frame seeming almost too large for the chair he sat in. "They see my size and assume I'm nothing but muscle. Can't count how many times I've surprised someone by reading a book or doing sums in my head." Their shared understanding of being judged by appearance formed a bond between them that deepened with each passing week. Thomas began bringing books from the ranch library when he discovered Valerie's love of reading. She, in turn, treated the various minor injuries he sustained while building cuts, splinters, bruises with the same serious attention she would give any patient. By mid-September, the cabin was nearly complete. Thomas had added special touches throughout shelves at Valerie's height, a medical workspace with perfect lighting from carefully placed windows, a stone fireplace that would keep the whole structure warm through winter. "We should celebrate," Valerie suggested one Saturday as they finished installing the last window. "I'll cook dinner tomorrow when we're done with the final details." Thomas nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "I'd like that." The next day, they worked side by side, hanging the front door, a solid piece that Thomas had carved with a pattern of herbs and flowers, acknowledging Valerie's medical practice. When the last hinge was secured, they both stood back to admire their work. "It's beautiful," Valerie said softly. "Far more than just a shelter." "A home should reflect its owner," Thomas replied, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That evening, Valerie prepared a meal from her garden's first harvest, supplemented by venison Thomas had brought. They ate at the custom height table he'd built, sitting across from each other in comfortable silence punctuated by easy conversation. "Winter will be here soon," Thomas observed as they finished their meal. "First snow usually comes by early October in these parts." "Will you still be able to visit?" Valerie asked, then immediately felt her cheeks flush at the presumption in her question. Thomas studied her face carefully. "Would you want me to?" The moment hung between them, fragile and significant. "Yes," she said simply. "Very much." He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "There's something I need to tell you, Valerie, about why I've been alone all these years." She waited, giving him space to find his words. "After the war, I had nightmares, bad ones. I'd wake up fighting, not knowing where I was." His massive hands gripped his coffee cup so tightly she feared it might shatter. "One night, I was staying in a boarding house. Woke up to find I'd put my fist through the wall, could have been a person's head. After that, I decided it wasn't safe for me to be close to folks, especially not women," she finished for him. He nodded. Been keeping to bunkhouses and staying to myself since then, safer that way. Valerie considered his words carefully. Have you had these nightmares while working on my cabin? You've fallen asleep by the fire more than once. Thomas looked surprised. No, actually, I haven't had one in months. He paused, realizing the implication. Not since I met you. Perhaps, she suggested gently, your soul knew it was safe here. The first snowfall came earlier than expected, only a week after the cabin was completed. Valerie woke to a world transformed, brilliant white stretching in all directions. She built up her fire and prepared for a day of organizing her medical supplies, assuming the weather would keep Thomas from visiting. But just after noon, she heard the sound of hooves crunching through snow. Looking out the window, she saw Thomas approaching, his massive form hunched against the cold, leading his horse rather than riding it. She flung open the door. Thomas, what are you doing out in this weather? His beard and eyebrows were frosted with ice, but he smiled at her concern. Brought you some things. Figured you might not be prepared for how quickly the weather turns up here. From his saddlebags, he produced extra blankets, preserved foods, and more firewood than seemed possible to carry. You walked 4 miles through snow for this. She asked, helping him bring the supplies inside. Would have been here sooner, but the drifts slowed me down. He stamped his boots clean before entering, immediately making the cabin seem smaller with his presence. You can't possibly return to the ranch tonight, Valerie said firmly. The temperature is dropping and the wind is picking up. Thomas hesitated at the door. I don't want to impose. It's hardly imposing when you built this roof over my head, she replied. Besides, I believe I'm still your doctor and I'm ordering you to stay out of that blizzard. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Yes, madam. As the storm intensified outside, they settled into a comfortable evening by the fire. Thomas fixed a loose board on one of the shelves, and Valerie prepared a hearty stew that filled the cabin with savory aromas. I've been thinking, Thomas said as they sat before the fireplace after dinner, about what you said regarding my nightmares. Valerie set aside her mending. What have you concluded? That maybe I've been punishing myself for too long. His voice was low, nearly lost beneath the crackling of the fire. Keeping away from any chance at happiness because I didn't think I deserved it after the things I saw, the things I did in the war. The young man you were survived an impossible situation, Valerie said gently. The man you are now deserves peace. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. You've never once flinched away from me. Most people do, you know. They see my size and assume danger. Perhaps because I know what it's like to be judged by one's stature rather than one's character. She smiled softly. Besides, I've watched those hands build a home with more care than most men show their prized possessions. He glanced down at his hands, massive, calloused, capable of bending metal and breaking bones, then back at her, so small and yet so unafraid. Valerie, he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. Yes, Thomas. I think I've been building more than just a cabin these past months. She set aside her work completely and moved to sit beside him. I think so too. The blizzard lasted 3 days. They remained snowbound in the cabin, and in that time, the fragile connection between them strengthened into something neither had dared hope for. Thomas spoke of his dreams of someday having his own ranch, not to raise cattle for market, but to breed and train horses. Valerie shared her plans to establish her medical practice and perhaps eventually train other women in healing arts. On the morning of the 4th day, the snow stopped and the sun emerged, turning the landscape into a dazzling expanse of white. They stood together in the doorway, surveying the transformed world. I should get back to the ranch, Thomas said reluctantly. They'll be wondering what happened to me. Valerie nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. Of course, you have responsibilities. He turned to face her, suddenly looking uncertain despite his imposing size. Valerie, I've never been good with words, but I need to say something before I go. She waited, heart suddenly racing. These months working beside you, getting to know you, they've been the best of my life. His voice was rough with emotion. I came out west thinking I'd never find a place where I truly belonged, but I was wrong. My place is with you if you'll have me." Tears welled in Valerie's eyes. "Are you certain? The town still talks. They say cruel things about both of us, the giant and the dwarf they call us." Thomas gently took her small hands in his enormous ones. "Let them talk. What do they know of the measure of a person's heart?" "Nothing at all," she whispered, rising on tiptoe as he bent down to meet her halfway in their first kiss. Spring came to Silver Creek with unusual gentleness that year. The snow melted gradually, feeding the creek rather than flooding it. The land around Valerie's cabin erupted in wildflowers, and her medicinal garden expanded to 3 times its original size. Thomas had resigned from his position at Anderson Ranch and was building a small stable adjacent to the cabin. They'd acquired 2 more parcels of land, and his dream of breeding horses was taking physical form with each post he set. Valerie's medical practice had grown steadily through the winter. Her knowledge and skill quickly overcame initial skepticism, and now patients came from as far as 20 miles away, seeking her treatments. She designed a special examining table that could be raised or lowered depending on the patient's needs, an innovation that Thomas had built with his usual care and precision. "Dr. Morrison from Denver is coming next week," Valerie announced one evening as they sat on the porch Thomas had added to the cabin. "He's agreed to formally review my work. If he approves, I might receive official recognition from the Colorado Medical Society." Thomas smiled, genuine pride illuminating his features. "They'd be fools not to recognize you. You've saved more lives this winter than that drunk in town they call a doctor has in 5 years." She leaned against his solid form, still marveling at how perfectly they fit together despite their disparate sizes. "And what about you? Mr. Henderson's mare is due any day now. Your first foal will make this officially a horse ranch." "Our first foal," he corrected gently. "Our ranch." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their land. They now worked together, each contributing their unique strengths. The cabin Thomas had built with his hands had become the heart of their shared dream, adapted to accommodate Valerie's stature without drawing attention to it, sturdy enough to withstand the elements yet beautiful in its craftsmanship. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his arm around her shoulders. "About making things more official between us." Valerie looked up at him. "What did you have in mind? The circuit judge will be in Silver Creek next month." His voice held a question. She smiled, happiness radiating from her entire being. "Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Prescott?" "I believe I am, Valerie Dawson." He shifted to face her, taking her small hands in his large ones. "I know we make an unusual pair. I know people still stare and whisper, but I've never felt more at home than I do with you." "Yes," she said simply. 1,000 times yes." The wedding took place on their property on a perfect June day. The townspeople of Silver Creek came, some out of genuine affection, others from curiosity, but neither Valerie nor Thomas cared about their motivations. They stood before the judge, the contrast in their heights drawing a few poorly concealed smiles that faded when they spoke their vows with such evident devotion that even the most hardened skeptics were moved. "I promise to build our life together with the same care I built this home," Thomas vowed, his deep voice steady and sure. "To create a world where you never need feel small or less than your magnificent self." "And I promise to heal whatever wounds life brings us," Valerie replied, "to see the greatness in you that others miss, and to stand tall beside you all the days of my life." As the years passed, their property expanded and flourished. Thomas's Prescott horses became known throughout Colorado territory for their quality and temperament. Valerie's medical practice grew into a small clinic where she trained 2 young women as assistants. The cabin Thomas had built evolved too, with additions that maintained its special adaptations for Valerie while accommodating their growing success. 5 years after their wedding, they welcomed their first child, a daughter who inherited her father's height and her mother's delicate features. 2 years later came a son, built like his mother but with his father's steady temperament. On the 10th anniversary of the day Valerie had first arrived in Silver Creek, they hosted a celebration on their property. The same townspeople who had once mocked her now sought her medical expertise and his business acumen. The children who had once whispered cruel names now attended the small school Valerie taught at twice weekly. As twilight fell and their guests departed, Thomas and Valerie stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Their children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Valerie asked, leaning against the railing Thomas had built at precisely her height. "When you defended me in the trading post," Thomas smiled, the scar along his jaw now faded with time. "I think about how brave you were, standing up to them despite everything. I knew then you were someone special. And I remember looking up at you way up and thinking you were the first person who ever really saw me." She reached for his hand. "Thank you for building me more than just a home, Thomas. Thank you for building me a life where I never have to feel small." He knelt down to kiss her, as he always did, meeting her halfway. "In all the ways that matter, Valerie Prescott, you have always been the biggest person I know." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the life they had created together, a life that had begun with mockery and isolation, but had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring on the Colorado frontier, where a giant cowboy and a small doctor had found in each other the perfect measure of love.